So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's very exciting to take part in such a carefully targeted examination of Minoan architecture, especially here in the adopted city of Jacobs, then at the University of Graham and Shaw, and now Knappett, and temporarily at least Le Tesson. I have put up this quote from Jane Jacobs, whose work I take as an inspiration in writing this paper, only an inspiration, a suggestion of avenues of thought, or I should say short city blocks of thought, full of random chance encounters and frequent changes of direction, certainly mixed use and hopefully dense. And it is not without trepidation that I get up in front of this crowd to present critical thoughts about our beloved Daedalus. And of course I have to apologize to Louise for stealing her title. Her paper from the Technic Conference addressed the case of two sets of rooms from Festos that she suggested represented the same architectural module whose phenotypic differences resulted from different execution, perhaps different crews. Perhaps more significantly, she broaches the question of just who carried out these building projects in both design and execution and how that process unfolded. Generally, we accept the element of planning in both private and civic architecture during the Minoan times, and I should say chronologically I'm focusing on the neo-palatial, however unhelpful and broad that chronological term may be. And I will be going backwards and forwards. Jan had mentioned in a paper some years ago that LM1A was the time to be in vogue, architecturally speaking, but I think we would now stretch this back to MM3A and perhaps forward to LM1B as well. We are haunted a bit by myth with this subject and time frame, and Clary has suggested the presence of a master builder, a Daedalus, for reasons both aesthetic and organizational. I'm not going to argue the point here, but to stake out my own assumptions, I largely agree that it certainly seems that in addition to the obvious signs of and evidence for town planning and architecture, that is architecture that is measured in both conception and execution, there is also a sense of the impact of genius at some point. Whether an individual, a Daedalus, or a tightly knit school of craftsmen and designers, a master builder whose impact would be felt not only in the transmission of his or her designs, but also in the broader awareness of that role, of that position, and its importance to the culture. In fact, I suspect that one reason the Minoan palaces are essentially unsigned has to do with how much they were the products of the architect rather than the patron, and this too would trickle down in peripheral imitation, this role of a master builder. I think likewise that we can see signs of civic or town planning, and obviously there's a problem of definition here, as it depends on your definition of planning. For my own purposes, when I talk about planning, I mean where a conceptual order is imposed on the built form, where an abstract higher level authority imposes on private or lower level space, where essentially the needs of the town supersede and are imposed on the individual structures within. That's Palais-Castro and Gorgna. Now, I've become interested in this for two reasons. One is, as I said, the idea of Minoan architecture as remarkably modern and sophisticated, and towns that are at least to some degree planned, is pretty well established. But if you read Jacobs or Bill Hillier, who took a lot of ideas from her, and even just looking around, you can see that town planning and architectural design are quite often disastrous. And it seems that that doesn't cross over to our understanding of the Minoans, and perhaps we are a little too proud of their achievements. Secondly, working at Palais-Castro, I came across a number of examples of mistakes in design or execution and found that thinking about them led me to a somewhat different understanding of the role of building and architecture in Minoan Crete. So I'm going to start with the buildings themselves. And with mistakes in execution, I like the stop at the, see that's the stop on the street? Before going on to issues of design and then on to towns, and I will of necessity focus on Palais-Castro, and especially on the southeast building of Block M. So there is this have a light? No. Anyway, you can see Block M there. It does work, but you have to press the little red dot? Yeah. So this is all of Block M, and this is the southeast building down here. It's been called Building 6, Area 6. There's been other names. Now that it's been published by Carl and I, it is the southeast building of Block M. And there it is. So I want to start with this drain, which you can see right here, right? Draining this the court out to the street out there. Now, it's fairly carefully built. It has lined with fairly well-fitting slabs, as you can see there. But the pitch of this drain was 1 in 12, which is much steeper than is necessary. Nowadays, plumbers usually use about 1 in 48. Minoan drains vary, but anything over 1 in 25 is probably going to cause problems. In other words, if there is any substantial flow of water down there, it's going to erode the sides and or create a problem when it meets the street drain out here, which it's going to meet at a right angle. And it did cause problems, and unsurprisingly, it had to be modified. There's a photograph of the original lower base of the drain, and there's what they had to do, which is fill in with soil and rocks and put in one of these clay drain pipes here about halfway up the height of the drain in an effort to control the flow going off into the street drain out there. Now, just to step back for a minute, this building mostly dates to Middle Minoan 3A. There's some signs of a Middle Minoan 2B precursor and modifications afterwards in MM3B. Block M is one of the main town blocks, as you can see, located right along Main Street there across from Block Delta. This portion of the main street, running between Delta and M, is particularly, you can see, very, very straight. And in there are 3 phases of paving, MM2, LM1, and LM3. There's some indication that there was ashlar along, this is the wall you see here is the east facade. It's not actually that's an LM1B retaining wall. There was an earlier wall line there. So we had some indications of an ashlar facade along here with a kind of crepidoma of regularly built blocks there, and with what seemed to be the backing stones holding in the floor to the west. And the wall itself had been robbed out from the street to the east. And we found a fragment, that's the base for the ashlar wall, and that's a picture in there. We found one fragment of an ashlar block in the robbing trench when this wall was robbed out in LM1B. And there was, of course, a closed street drain running along this street here. And this street runs directly up and comes down, is running up and down the hill from Petsofa, so it must have actually carried quite a bit of water. So this modification, which had a Middle Minoan 3A ledge rim cup set underneath it, inverted, joined in the street. We dug in there enough to see that there was the earlier street drain, and there was another drain coming from this room here. It runs at an angle, and we found it beneath MM2 with an MM2A fill covering it, so probably constructed at the same time, at the beginning of MM2B and connecting to this drain. So the drain system here along the street, and even in a precursor to the building, was already there in MM2B. When they added this drain in MM3A, which is when most of what you see here was probably added and built, the height that they put the court at, they wanted to get all the way down to the street drain, so they had to make this extreme pitch, which then didn't actually work. Now I'm going to move on to room 8 over here to see some modifications there. In its original MM3A conception, it's a large space. You can see it's very nicely paved with schist stones and plaster in between, and it was sunken below the court, as you can see, right? So it's a sunken room. Where am I here? Sunken room below the court, steps down to it. The original steps form a kind of a dog leg, and as you can see here, they were made out of clay with some plaster on them. And again, as we've seen, with all the water coming into the open court, that obviously was going to be a problem, and they later had to modify it by putting in stone steps and changing the access into the room there. Also, the size of the room seemed to be a problem, and they later put this transverse wall across, possibly to support. There were several little indications that this might have been to support a raised wooden floor at a higher level there was little benches up against the walls, all at the same height, and a beam slot in this wall. So whether it was just for structural reasons or, as I say, maybe to support this raised wooden floor, in any case, whatever the original conception of this floor was, with this very carefully paved surface and this sort of sunken basin in it, all, again, very nicely plastered, that did not survive this particular modification. Another problem of materials had to do at the far end of the open court, where there was some very large limestone slab paving put in here of a very, very soft stone that was probably very ill-suited to that task, and even when this area was being robbed out and they took stones from all the way around, they got to about this part and these stones were too big, so they left a piece of that one sitting there, and here probably they tried to take these and they just fractured and crumbled when they were trying to rob those out in LM3. And then finally here, this pier and door partitions, which you can see even in the plan how they are fragmented, and they're not just broken. They were actually the middle T-shaped piers were made in two pieces, probably because the stone, which was a kind of serpentinite, not normally used for this kind of thing, was ill-suited to the task. There was one other door jamb base found in this building from the same period, and I think there's a column base at Malia. But otherwise, I don't know of any use of that particular kind of stone for architectural features like this. And of course, they're part of a wooden structure. The end ones in particular had projecting tenons that were below the ground surface to attach them into a beam. Still, it's another case where they simply used the wrong kind of stone. So these are some examples of problems with execution, and there are others, but I want to move on to some issues of design. This is pictures of the pier and door partitions, and there they are. Let's see, there you can see how that is actually cut there. It has been made in two pieces. So here you have this pier and door partition, which opens through the polythron into a colonnaded open court. And this has been misidentified as a Minoan hall by many people, including myself, actually. But really, by Jan's own criteria, it isn't. It is not axial, it has no light well, and it is not an architectural unit. It's not a single architectural unit. Now, it's possible to expand and play with definitions, and I see I'm not getting the whole picture here. Let's see. I'm going to go back to one where I can see the whole thing. There. So you can change the, you can see this one room with the polythron opening onto this larger rectangular court is not in any way a single architectural unit. And when Quentin, his recent HAA paper, was working through the Minoan hall system using space syntax, he found a rather wide variation in the way that these Minoan hall systems function spatially, a variation which he interprets as reflecting a chronological shift in needs, which seems reasonable enough. But I was also struck by the notion that this wide variation in how these halls, how the spatial function of these halls, the way that they distribute integration is so different, suggests that that aspect is not actually an important or essential component of the architectural definition of the spaces, chronology notwithstanding. In other words, either the category is false, and in this case, I don't think we can say the category is false. Minoan halls are pretty easily recognized. Or the criteria, the spatial configuration, is just not an essential part of that unit's identity. Now, although people like Hillier would certainly like to believe that this kind of spatial grammar underlies or precedes such identity, it is certainly not always so. And here, with these Minoan halls, my suggestion is that what is important is a kind of signification, a kind of iconographic signification. And that is what gets copied and carried forward recognizably, so that systems with many different qualities of spatial configuration can still be included as Minoan halls, but the rules surrounding the formal aspects are much more strict. In other words, it is the use of the decorative elements that seem to be more important than the spatial characteristics. In the southeast building here, we actually have a very clear parallel for this architectural form with a central open court surrounded by rooms, some of them sunken, one major room with a polythrion off of it, and that is the central courts of the palaces. Obviously, this is not a palace. It's not even a quasi-palace. It's not even one of the sort of close contenders. So the only reason to actually see it as anything else is to decide that you can't have a central court except in a palace. Makrielos would be another example of something where you have that. But since it actually does belong to that form of an open court surrounded by rooms, which you normally only see in a palace, I think it's better to see that that is in fact what it is. And again, here we have another kind of error, but one of design. They've gone and put a central court arrangement into a domestic or a non-palatial building, and it shouldn't, in a way, be there. But that gets to the question of what kind of building this is. And in Block M, generally, there were two buildings belonging to this period. I have a picture of the whole block somewhere. There we go. So there's two buildings, the northwest, the southeast. The northwest, much more typical sort of domestic buildings. There was a winemaking installation, a little court here for having drinks, big staircase, kitchen. And then this building, which had no sign of storerooms, no sign of storage vessels, even really in the sherd material. This big open court, as I've said, with the sunken rooms, there was a kind of hosting deposit of cups and drinking vessels. And some evidence for Ashla Facades. The Ashla Facades themselves, though, not very well made. I mean, the Crepidoma, compared to what we get later, maybe that's a chronological issue. It was not very well. You can see here for Block Gamma, they've kind of made, I think that's the bedrock there, but that's the base for the Ashla Facade there. Very different. So in that sense, it was a lot less solid. But of course, the thing about Ashlar masonry that really sticks out is the extra organization it produces by adding a whole extra step of quarrying, which is that you could say that they quarry earth for mud brick or rubble masonry, but the process of quarrying and transporting ashlar blocks creates a very clear organization of workers and workflow. And these are sledge ruts from the quarries at Tuscaria, which you can see running. So whether the methods were learned elsewhere and brought back by locals or overseers, even if it was the first exposure after it was done, you have increased the level of organization among workers. So this greater organization and the sort of attachment of the workers is a major function of ashlar masonry, not to mention the need for a master mason, if not an architect, to direct things. Another notable aspect of this building was copious amounts of painted plaster, including imitations of marbled stones, which brings me to another aspect that I think is sometimes overlooked in Minoan architecture. And we all know about the similarities between Minoan art and architecture and the styles in vogue at the time it was being discovered, parallels with arts and crafts or Art Nouveau or Jugendstil, and that has been to some degree exaggerated. Some have gone so far as to say created, but we know that that isn't true. We can go back to William Morris, who predated any Minoan discoveries, and look forward to Akrotiri, which didn't have any of that kind of restoration, to see how similar they really were. But what that gets lost in this discussion is a very important tenet of arts and crafts, maybe less so of the continental offshoots, but still present, and that's Ruskin's truth to materials, that the material of a construction should be evident, and nothing could be more at odds with Minoan art and architecture, which is full of fakery, from plaster painted as stone, rubble disguised as ashlar, hidden wooden structural elements. The Minoans were consummate fakers. In fact, we found on a Sideropatra column base, let's see. So we have the column bases. There's one here, and there's another one. Right, yeah, there it is. We found the remains of what we thought was going to be part of the column, and it was plaster. It went about 6 centimeters, 7 centimeters high, and was rounded and fit nicely on this nice column base. And then when we actually got our plaster specialist to look in what was there, it was just earth and rubble. Maybe it was a matter of pure coincidence, and a rounded chunk of plastered rubble fell exactly onto the column base, just like that. but it may also have been a purely ornamental column that was actually made out of plastered rubble. And obviously with the alternating columns and pillars, such as at Malia, they probably don't have any real structural necessity for both. They could either of those could be ornamental. And we do know that ornamental columns and pillars are fairly common. But I don't think we have considered how many of our beloved inverted columns could be just for show. So while this aspect isn't really a mistake, it's more a matter of deception or sleight of hand, it is disguising ornamental elements as structural ones, and I think that is something that has broad resonance for Minoan Crete. And is this just palaeostro? I don't think so. I'll try to get more to that later on, but looking back at Minoan halls, which we typically praise as how wonderful and modern they are, in allowing flowing light and air, sort of functional aspects. As we've seen, it's not so easy to argue that their spatial function was especially important to their architectural identity, and I have to ask if they were actually even successful at being pleasant. You would wind up with up to 28 door leaves in the little palace that would need to be secured, whether they were going to be open or shut. That is each little individual door. And in terms of guiding airflow, I don't know if you ever tried to guide the airflow on Crete, but it tends not to work. So even if it was less windy, they would be rattling and breaking constantly, and only with a huge staff could you even stand them, I would think. And I think it's probably no surprise that when they get remodeled, and they almost always are, they are usually sealed off and converted into walls, just as the lustral basins tend to get filled in. I think that again, the important aspect is the signification, not the practicality. And what looks like structure or deep function turns out to be ornamental, even with these, as we can see more clearly perhaps in the peripheral imitations. And that they are imposed on an eventually unwilling populace, no less than the built-in furniture in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, also notoriously difficult to live in. And iconographically, of course, the arrangement with the pier and door partitions creates a niched wall, which has always signified elite and sacred spaces throughout Egypt and the Near East during this time period. And a final point about this Block M here in that southeast building is that after an earthquake in MM3B, the whole plot is stripped and left empty. And although there are many reasons as to why that might be, common to all of them is the conclusion that that building, in fact, did not belong there. Again, it was a mistake of planning. Okay, so moving on to towns. Continuing with the subject of, it wasn't actually ever built. Continuing with the subject of architectural falsehoods, let's look at the streets. Now we can see that Main Street at Palaeostro is given great importance. It has Ashla Facades on it. It is artificially straight and maintained from Middle Minoan 2 through LM3. But if you look actually at the pavements, there is a sandstone up at the top, and then there was a schist paving, which isn't actually present in this particular section drawing, and then more sandstone down here. So we have an MM2 sandstone phase, maybe MM2-3, and then LM1 schist paving, and then a sort of reused sandstone paving for LM3. And again, these are purely ornamental. Schist and sandstone are not going to hold up to any kind of heavy use. Now, if you look at Gornja, as we saw, and I don't have a picture, but you got to see the pictures there, you see it's a very different scale and organization from this. You can see these are the same scales. So you see that's just, well, that's that one stretch. That's about 50 meters. And then, it jogs a little bit. But this section here of Main Street is really different in kind than what we see at Gornja. And at Gornja, we also see proper paving with these heavy cobbles that I'm sure were much more pragmatic and less grandiose in conception, but a lot more durable. And a street like this, you have a bit of a corner here, I suppose, but you would expect to see that in an orthogonal town layout. But there's really no suggestion that that's actually the case. It's really down to a single street that is maintained for 300 years with that kind of, rigor, let's say. So streets themselves create the distinction between public and private space, but street construction obliterates that very distinction. That is to say, building or fashioning streets requires one to identify the intersection of different kinds of space and different claims to property. Whatever they might be, there is always a decision to be made about where a street will go, even if it is just following an earlier route, or what boundaries to respect, even if they have always been respected. And that is why, to this day, street and road construction, rights of way, transportation routes, these seemingly mundane aspects of city and town planning, continue to dominate civic debates. Jane Jacobs' successful battle against Robert Moses comes to mind. At Palais-Castro, with the initial construction of Block M in MM2B and 3A, it was carried out at the same time and presumably using the same crews as the construction of Main Street itself. And that's because partly of this drain system which connects to the drains in Main Street, and there was an enormous fill in this whole part of the building, about a meter, added all through to raise the level. And that whole project with the streets would have been happening at roughly the same time with the same people. And it was also at this moment that the MM1 building in Block He there, that actually sticks out into Main Street, went out of use, and then it was rebuilt to fit in a little bit better. Don't know if you can see that so well. And for the next 300 years at least, the street maintains these lines without encroachment. But it's not, as I said, a central artery in a grid of similar streets, as most of the streets in town were not constructed and maintained with such rigor. Now, a street like this, particularly when it is such a rarity and when it requires the forceful imposition of the conceptual onto the actual, is going to have a profound symbolic impact and is, in a sense, a kind of monument itself. But it might not have been especially useful in other ways. It would probably have had something of an alienating effect, in fact, and the unsuitability of the paving for heavy traffic suggests its purpose was more ornamental than pragmatic. So here we have more deception, in a sense. A street that seems to belong to an orthogonal layout, but it is only one street. Now, certainly it was possible for the Minoans to plan and build a proper gridded town. Some of them had probably lived at one in Cahoon in Egypt. That they didn't do that is a matter of choice, and probably a sensible one. Oddly enough, given its importance, town planning seems to be very hard to do well on purpose. I don't know how much real town planning or design there is on Crete, perhaps at Knossos, but otherwise it seems restricted to certain areas within a town, such as on Main Street at Palais-Castro. And obviously I'm now using the term planning in the strictest sense, where a conceptual plan with its own internal aesthetic rules is imposed on the townscape, whether a grid or some more fanciful layout. Certainly nothing is built entirely by accident, so everything is planned to some degree. The two major problems with most town and city planning have to do with circulation and districting, or the separation of function. One can't really compare modern planning problems with towns on the scale of what we see in Crete, with the exception perhaps of Knossos. But some of these issues might scale down. With circulation, problems arise when local traffic is segregated from global routes. Long blocks and bypasses are bad. Short blocks with multiple routes for any journey are good. Excessive segregation of function is also problematic. Mixed use seems to work better. Now, trying to look at planning in Minoan Crete is difficult, partly because of issues with the data. For example, some degree of functional segregation is usually assumed, as at Moklos, where the artisans' quarter may be just that, or it may be typical of a much larger percentage of the town. There really is not enough town there to say. How much of the full extent and character of the various towns that have been excavated, Zakros, Palais-Castro, Moklos, Kornia, is very uncertain. Possibly Psira gives a more complete picture, but seems dangerous to try and extrapolate from there. In any case, it's impossible to know if this kind of functional segregation, if it existed, was imposed or somewhat organically developed. As far as circulation is concerned, we have a somewhat clearer picture. Most of the streets and routes we have were what might typically be considered unplanned, meandering, following contours, vernacular, practical, variable. But at certain points, such as Palais-Castro Main Street, or more notably at the larger palatial sites, we have attempts at controlling and directing circulation in rather explicitly coercive ways. All three of the major palaces have distinct west courts with raised forking paths right at the intersection of town and palace. Whether or not people were expected or required at certain times to use these paths, the very contrast between them and the standard routes suggests that they would be at least as notable for the Minoans. In some way, these approaches show a greater degree of differentiation than the palaces themselves do architecturally from some of the surrounding buildings. Now, this interface between town and palace is also the back wall of the main storerooms, at least in the case of Knossos, Festos, and Maia. In each case, probably the most monumentalized aspect of each structure. You can come in from town, and then there is a huge wall, probably disguised to look like huge solid stones, although, of course, the only ones that are real are the orthostates, the only ones you can touch. Above that, it's rubble. At this point, you are also confronted with a kind of crowd control, which is to say, even if you only stick to the path on certain occasions, it's only there. It's also important to remember that with these storerooms, you have a big wall to announce its presence, and inside the storerooms you might have big pithoi, but most people would have no idea just how much grain or whatever else was actually inside. Quite the opposite, in fact. So in a way, it's more sleight of hand. This kind of sudden interruption of normal access, the way the palaces actually tend to block movement through the towns, seems to be used for effect, as it's not necessarily a comfortable way of organizing movement, and likewise the central courts. There's a good evidence that these courts were important social venues long before they were surrounded by buildings. So aside from the very dramatic step of choosing to enclose these public courts inside a huge building with controlled access, restricted, at least in the case of Knossos, it's also ordinarily considered a mistake of design, as enclosed courtyards are not usually successful. So, in a way, I have been trying to point out that the functional aspects of Minoan architecture were perhaps not as important as the symbolic, and that there is a great deal of disguise and obfuscation as well, all of which seems especially concentrated in what we could broadly consider official or elite architecture. There is vernacular architecture. There are constructions that are expressly pragmatic. Often these are modifications, and usually they always use simple materials, rubble. They're not orthogonal. They're done quickly and effectively. Whenever we see something that has obviously been measured and trued and plumbed, I think we should beware. Block M, for example, had a palatial architectural design but wasn't a palace. Main Street looks like it belongs in a gridded town plan, but it isn't. These large open courts should be public, but they aren't. Were these elite official architectural forms the result of a quest for luxury and comfort on the part of a successful elite and their emulators? Or were they a way of exercising control by requiring organized labor crews and concentrations of labor while maintaining the appearance of egalitarianism, the trappings of luxury and the good life, rather than overt statements of personal or group power? Now, Crete often gets compared with Egypt and the Near East, and let me be more specific, talking about the Near East, I mean Mesopotamia, but Todd brought this up. But there are two very, very significant ways in which those areas differ from Crete. And in fact, they almost seem like the two most sort of glaring obvious things. And that is that both Egypt and Mesopotamia are strongly influenced by certain geographic constraints, these rivers, the Nile and the Tigris and the Euphrates, which really define the relationship of the state to the citizen. And secondly, you see it reflected. So with Egypt, where you have a Nile that gives you tillable, productive soil as long as you live next to it, from very early on, you see this overwhelming emphasis on military power, uniting the two parts of the Nile, and the pharaoh as the great military leader, because the people are there, you just have to control them with force. In Mesopotamia, you have a situation where group work on irrigation produces enormous results. You get much, much more return if you can manage the irrigation systems in southern Mesopotamia. So from very early on, you have a control of surplus and administration, especially with the system of bulai and tokens. So both those places really are defined by these geographic situations, which is also reflected in their, whatever you want to call it, character. But Crete is very, very different. And in Crete, I don't think there is anything that is locking the populace there so that you can control them with force, and there is no desert around them that keeps them needing the food. So I would suspect that a lot of Minoan elite culture, and certainly the way that I think they're using architecture, has to do with other forms of coercion that take the guise of more egalitarian projects. They disguise the power structure. They might look like heterarchy when they're actually not. And I would say that the same would be true of a lot of this architecture, so it looks like a nice, fine house, but really it just signifies a system of control. So Daedalus might have designed originally some of these things for the enjoyment and the good life, but the way that they were then taken up and used by his patrons went in a very different direction. The end.